So Justin Jefferson has been on an absolute tear this season. Since he entered the league 3 years ago, he's been one of the best receivers, but this year he really kicked it into high gear, to the extent that he's on pace to break the NFL's all-time receiving yardage record. Calvin Johnson broke the record 10 years ago when he caught for just under 2,000 yards in the 2012 season. And since then, a couple of guys have gotten close, but no one's been able to crack it. Until now. With Jefferson's historic season in mind, today we're going to be looking at the top 10 all-time leaders in receiving yardage and talk about what factors led to Justin Jefferson being in this position to secure one of the most illustrious records in the entire NFL. We can't talk about this list without talking about Megatron. As I mentioned, in 2012, he broke the receiving yardage record, and he caught for 1,964 yards. At this point, he was playing with a prime Matthew Stafford and an offense that really suited his play style. On top of the receiving yardage record, he also caught 122 passes, which makes this season also one of the most efficient receiving seasons ever. Ultimately, Megatron's career had a bittersweet ending, as he retired at the relatively young age of 30, having spent his whole career in Detroit. Throughout his entire career, he was only a part of 2 winning teams, and was even part of one of the worst teams ever. It's not all sad though, as a couple of years ago, he was inducted into the Hall of Fame on his first ballot. Next on the list is Cooper Kupp. A few seasons ago, the NFL decided to expand their regular season to 17 games instead of 16. That's why, even though the 2008 Lions went 0-16, it's still possible for a team to be worse than them now that the doors open for an 0-17 season. Another side effect of this season expansion is that records like this will be more easily broken in the future. In one of the first years of a 17-game season, Cooper Kupp proved that by going for over 1,900 yards. This being one of the more recent seasons on this list, I can tell you watching him play felt exactly how this chart looks. He was incredibly dominant the entire season, and also used it to come close to the reception record, putting up 145 on the year along with 16 touchdowns. While Megatron's season was certainly incredible, there's certainly an argument that the 2021 Cooper Kupp season was the best season for a receiver ever. And remember how I said that Calvin Johnson only played for 2 winning teams throughout his entire career? Yeah, the Rams this season won the Super Bowl. Next up on the list is Julio Jones' 2015 season. If you really want to relive the experience of watching this guy play in his prime, I'd recommend looking up a few highlight tapes on YouTube. It really was one of the most incredible seasons by a receiver ever. Felt like every other week he would be on SportsCenter's top 10, having mossed a cornerback out of this world. On top of 1,871 yards this season, he also had 136 receptions and 8 touchdowns. Though this season the Falcons finished at a mere 8-8, they did have a cap in their feather, in that they were the only loss on the 15-1 Carolina Panthers schedule. This Panthers team was one of the best teams ever assembled, and in their lone loss of the season, Julio Jones put up 9 receptions for 178 yards and a touchdown. The year after, the Falcons would go 11-5 and make the Super Bowl, though we all know how that turned out. Next on the list at number 4 is Jerry Jones' 1995 season, where he went for 122 receptions for 1,846 yards, along with 15 touchdowns. As the NFL's all-time leading receiver, it's kind of confusing to see Jerry Rice outside of the top 3 on this list. But although he's only number 4 on this list, if you expand it out to top 50, he's got 4 placements. I think what this says about Jerry Rice's career is that, while he certainly had an incredible peak, the reason most consider him to be the greatest receiver of all time is because he was so good for so long. Number 32 on this list is Jerry Rice's 1986 season, so look at it this way. 9 years after putting up a historic receiving season, Jerry Rice had enough fuel left in the tank to have an incredible season and break the top 5 of all time. Jerry Rice was one of the best receivers ever in a block of time that you could slot Calvin Johnson's entire career into. Anyway, next on the list we've got a bit of a character. You might recognize him as the guy who took off his jersey and pads in the middle of an NFL game and then walked out in the middle of the third quarter, but if we could just forget the last 3 years, most of us would remember Antonio Brown as one of the best receivers of this generation. He didn't have Megatron or Julio's incredible athletic ability, but he played more similarly to Cooper Kupp. an expert route runner with sure hands, playing with an incredibly competent veteran quarterback. Something that shows just how dominant Antonio Brown was in his peak is the fact that he's the only player that's on this list twice. Granted, this is technically a top 11 list, but he's the only guy over the entire course of NFL history to crack this list twice. If you didn't watch him play live, then you definitely missed out. Because before he went crazy or his brain turned to mashed potatoes, Antonio Brown was one of the most likable receivers in the NFL, and also one of the best. Also worth noting, he wasn't on the Buccaneers. I just like this picture a little bit more. Just keeps me sane, you know? Nevertheless, Antonio Brown's 2015 season ranks highly amongst the best of all time. Next up on the list is Isaac Bruce's 1995 season, in which he put up 1,780 yards and 13 touchdowns. If I asked you who his quarterback was during this season, if you had to guess, you'd probably say Kurt Warner. But what's really interesting about this season is that it was actually pre-Kurt Warner, meaning pre-good quarterback, and Isaac Bruce put up this incredible season with a guy named Chris Miller. At this point, Chris Miller had been in the league for almost a decade, and right after this season, he would end up retiring, which opened the door for new quarterback Kurt Warner to come in and lead the Rams to one of the best offenses ever assembled. Another crazy thing about this season is that Isaac Bruce was only 23 when it happened. It was only his second season. The season prior, he had put up 21 receptions for 272 yards and 3 touchdowns. So keep that in mind when you think about the Ja'Marr Chases and Justin Jeffersons of today, receivers who flourished very, very early into their career. Their archetypes aren't entirely new. People like Isaac Bruce have been doing what they're doing since before they came along. I don't know, just a thought. Next up on the list is the only guy I didn't know when I was researching this video. If I showed you this picture, you probably wouldn't be able to tell me who this guy is, unless you can read cursive, in which case you would know his name is Charlie Hennigan, and in 1961, this man went for 1,746 yards and 12 touchdowns. Absolutely insane. Good for statistically the 7th best receiving season of all time. He's the only guy on this list whose season came before 1995. I'm not sure how the hell he did it in an era when running the ball was one option and throwing the ball like Trace McSorley was the other. What makes this season even crazier is that he did it on 82 receptions, good for 21 yards per attempt. All time, this is the second most efficient receiving season in NFL history. For whatever reason, this dude was just like that. While he's probably not in contention for the best receiver of all time, maybe consider this guy when you're thinking about the best receivers of the pre-modern era. At number 8 on the list, we have Michael Thomas's 2019 season. He went for 1,725 yards along with 9 touchdowns, but what made this season really special was the 149 receptions that came along with it. This season was the complete opposite of our guy Charlie's, with Michael Thomas being a gaping vacuum that consumed all passes that entered his airspace. Surprisingly, at number 9 on this list, we have Marvin Harrison, who in 2002 went for 1,722 yards and 11 touchdowns. This guy, along with prime Peyton Manning and young Colts head coach Jeff Saturday, made for an absolutely lethal offense. On top of that, this season's also number 3 all-time in receptions, with Marvin Harrison catching the ball 143 times throughout 16 games. It's only fitting that he's right next to Michael Thomas, the guy who usurped his throne. Finally, at number 10, I mentioned it before, we have Antonio Brown's 2014 season, in which he went for 129 receptions, 1,698 yards, and 13 touchdowns. He combined with Le'Veon Bell and Ben Roethlisberger to form the Killer Bees, an elite set of offensive weapons. If I had to liken this trio to any current day team, it'd probably be the guy this video is all about, Justin Jefferson's Minnesota Vikings. Quarterback Kirk Cousins, running back Dalvin Cook, and receiver extraordinaire Justin Jefferson. Which brings us to the man of the hour. If you look inside his little chrysalis he has going on here, you'll see the season he currently has. Through 15 games, he's caught 123 passes for 1,756 yards and 8 touchdowns. The chrysalis is what he's projected for. If he plays all 16 games and he keeps pace with what he's done so far this season, he should end up with 1,990 yards, which would put him ahead of Calvin Johnson's 2012 season. Of course, he needs to maintain a historic pace to do it, but nothing so far has told us he can't. Possibly even more important than this season, though, is next season, and the season after that, because no one ever mentions Isaac Bruce in the conversation for the best receivers of all time. No disrespect to the man, he was incredible, he's certainly one of the best to ever do it, but he's not in the GOAT conversation. Not the way Randy Moss is, not the way Jerry Rice is, and not the way Justin Jefferson could be. I mentioned that in Isaac Bruce's second season, he had 1,780 yards, but the sad truth is after that, he never had a season as good again. And what we really hope for from Justin Jefferson is that he bucks that potential pattern. Even though Jerry Rice is considered to be the best receiver of all time, he's only on this list once. So even more important than this season, this record, this chase, is whether or not he can sustain it for his entire career. If he can, the world is his oyster, and by the time he retires, there's a very real chance that he ends up becoming the GOAT of all receivers.